Hi, it's great to be with you virtually, although obviously I prefer to be with you all in Australia right now. Despite the distance, I would love to hear from you with your reactions to this presentation, or if you want to learn more about how we think about the economics of AI, just get in touch. My email address is on the screen there, and I'd be more than happy to discuss further. My name's Shaun, and before joining Dataiku, I was head of data science and business intelligence at Cox Automotive here in the UK, and before that, a consultant at Optimal BI in Wellington, New Zealand. What I'll be discussing today is a problem in the way business cases for AI are often built and how to correct it. We see organizations do this often, and part of their journey with us is to move beyond the kind of thinking that I'll critique here. Now, it's worth noting from the outset, there's nothing proprietary to Dataiku in this presentation, so if the ideas do resonate and are helpful, please use them whether you're a customer or not. So having just said this won't be about Dataiku, I do want to make sure you know who we are. We're a leader in the Magic Quadrant for the second year running. We have customers of many sizes, including household names across different industries and parts of the world, and a rapidly growing presence in Asia Pacific too. If you would like to know more about the reasons Gartner named us as a leader, you can get a free copy of their 2021 report on our website or ping me afterwards. So what's this problem that we see with conventional business cases for AI? Well, it can take an awful lot of convincing your stakeholders to invest in an AI initiative. Think about all the people and technology you need to account for, and pretty quickly the costs pass $1 million if you're going from a standing start. Now, because of these high upfront costs, you in turn have to sell some really high value use cases to the business to get their backing. Maybe you can use AI to radically improve the personalization of recommendations on your website, increasing average order size. Or perhaps with a smarter approach to fraud detection, you can significantly reduce losses in your e-commerce operations. Or you might have one of the other specific use cases on the screen there. What this means, though, is that your whole initiative becomes like a highly leveraged loan. You've borrowed a significant sum from the business up front, promising far greater returns in future if they have faith that you will deliver. Now, there are plenty of stories out there about when the business plan doesn't play out exactly as it did on paper, and the stakeholders call in those loans they gave you and the whole thing sort of collapses. I'm not going to discuss those kinds of failures today. Today, I want to talk about the problem that this approach to business cases for AI generates, even if it is successful in delivering these first few use cases. Basically, plenty of AI initiatives are not surviving and thriving beyond the success of those initial use cases. But why is that? Well, we call that problem missing the value that's below the waterline. If you think about an iceberg, the great majority of the mass is actually below the water. The same is true of the potential value of AI to your enterprise. Yes, obviously, to find the iceberg in the first place, you do need to focus on those high-value initial use cases that do stick out of the water. But looking only at those obvious, easy, high-value use cases is deceiving because they're not common. They will run out, and your initial investors will actually be really happy with the returns they got, and they will go merrily on their way. And your IT department will look in their program overview and see the highly successful projects that you delivered and also think the job is done and dusted, give you a big tick. What they miss though, but which you know, is that AI needs to become a capability embedded in every part of your organization and not just this big special event. The work of using AI to transform your business is not like refreshing the website or opening an office in London or migrating to the cloud. It's never actually done. But you won't be very popular if after being successful on those initial use cases, you now go back to them for additional funding to pursue additional use cases that did not qualify as obvious, easy, and high value upfront. And in investment terms, it's not enough to simply repay that loan on the initial use cases they gave you. You need to pay back the interest and build something that will survive and grow beyond your initial startup period. If your investment case is only around the tip of the iceberg, it's quite obvious that the funding will dry up even if you're successful, and your team will leave to do more interesting work elsewhere. So in the rest of today's presentation, I'll share how we articulate their way to escape from this trap, which is all about surfacing the opportunity that's hidden below the waterline, but doing it from the beginning of your journey. So we'll escape the trap in 3 stages, like climbing a complex mountain on the left there. Obviously, before scaling any mountain, it really pays to have a vision of why you want to get to the top. With a mountain, of course, it's enough to say, because it's there, but that won't work in most organizations for AI business cases. So we believe that an enterprise AI initiative should set the lofty goal of scaling to augment and optimize processes everywhere in your organization. This will mean hundreds of people building thousands of use cases, all making contributions that by themselves might appear unremarkable. By themselves, they never would have qualified for your initial use cases, but together they add up to something that really matters. If you get this prize, it can be transformative, but its value cannot be articulated the same way as those initial use cases, as it's below the waterline value. In a moment, I'll offer some ways to quantify this value to stakeholders so you can tell that story early and often. Once you know why you want to get to the top of the mountain, you obviously do need to start somewhere and run hard and fast at those early use cases that form the tip of the iceberg. I won't discuss this stage further today because really most people are doing it well enough. Just I'll say that the reason we say remove friction here is that you do want the maximum momentum from those initial use cases on your journey. Focus today is on building business cases that will outlive those initial use cases. As I hinted in my opening, initial success, even if it's wild success, does not guarantee lasting success when it comes to AI. Exhausting as those initial use cases were to deliver in the first place, they're not actually going to propel you all the way up to that transformational goal at the top of the mountain called realizing AI at scale. And that's because the higher you get up the mountain, conditions change. Basically, you need to keep maintaining the use cases already delivered while pushing further into the unknown. And that inevitably exposes you to much greater risk. What if your organization suddenly changes cloud provider and you were relying on work done on exactly one cloud? What if 2 competitors of yours merge and customer behavior changes in an unexpected way on your e-commerce site? Or what if, God forbid, a global pandemic hits and ruins every single time series that you use in your forecasting? So the answer to these challenges that we propose is that you mitigate these risks ahead of time as you would any other risk by building resilience, which is just the ability to bounce back from these shocks and keep going. But the economic problem here is that the funders of your initial use case did not prepay for resilience. They only paid for those use cases that you delivered for them initially. So where will you get the funding to build resilience? As resilience is a long-term investment that actually benefits all use cases, it requires quite a different value story than the one that got you started. And that's because, again, the value of building resilience is a below the waterline value. It's not a use case that sticks out the top and gets all that attention. So in our remaining time, let's put on some scuba gear and take a look at this iceberg under the water to try and find value stories that you can use to build a business case that's going to get you all the way to the top of that big mountain, where AI is just another pervasive capability of your enterprise and not a special project focused on narrow and individual use cases. So we'll start at the big, grand, transformative vision story, which on the face of it may look unquantifiable. But with some imagination, you can find a way, as long as you move beyond adding up the use cases. So just to emphasize this point, the full value of enterprise AI to your business is not just the sum of the use cases that you deliver. It's about what's below the waterline, which is what is possible and what the benefits are in addition to all those specific use cases. If you can pull this off, it will completely change the conversation with your stakeholders, and you'll be able to pull them out of narrow per use case project-centric discussion, which is a really difficult way to build a durable, resilient, scalable AI initiative, and you'll be talking about something else. And the first thing you can talk about, the first value you can look to, is simply the value of putting the data that people need to make decisions in front of them, instead of locking it away in silos that they can't access. So as businesses digitize further, and this obviously accelerated in 2020, it will become even more obvious than it already is today that data from one silo is really not very useful by itself. And without other data joined to it, decision-making will become increasingly paralyzed. If more businesses build more of their processes digitally, and those are all built in different stacks, right? You can easily see how it's going to be harder and harder for business stakeholders to take decisions over time, unless we help them blur the boundaries between those silos. So how can you quantify the impact, the benefit of this? You can take a common decision that your organization makes today. Maybe there's a weekly, monthly, quarterly process that relies on coordination across silos, maybe adjusting pricing or forecasting supply and demand, something that involves different people having to make a decision across those silos. And you can do a small study on how much faster that decision could be made if the necessary data was available to all those around the table to start with. If you think about how these decisions are often made, most of the time is actually spent thinking about what questions need to be asked of the data. Then there's a waiting period while all the silos respond, and then all that data is brought back. So you could do a case study of one of these decisions and understand, well, what if we accelerated that decision and put the data in front of the people who needed it to start with? Once you get some kind of idea of how much of a speed up that would give in the decision-making process, you can multiply that by the number of such decisions that are made across silos. Again, that will be many. And now you have a rough order of magnitude estimate of the value of realizing AI at scale that's not tied to any individual use case. Another value story you can build, particularly if you spend a lot on technical resources like engineers and researchers, has to do with innovation. So many pharma companies, for example, have highly specialized teams handling specific parts of their innovation funnel. And in financial services, we often see banks setting up innovation labs. But the problem with sequestering away innovation from the rest of your business is that you massively reduce the diversity of perspectives you can bring to bear on a given problem. Again, how are you going to quantify this? You can quantify the under the waterline value of this missed innovation by understanding how innovations were made in your business in the past. Where did they come from and what value did they unlock? Once you look into that history, chances are that many of the more disruptive and valuable innovations that your business has come up with came from the so-called shop floor and not from these dedicated innovation teams. And those stories have the benefit of resonating with everyone else in the company. And if you can link the creation of those innovations by people on the ground to your initiative, you'll be able to say, well, what if we got one more of those innovations happening each year from the shop floor, if you like? How much would that be worth to us? And the final idea is something you'll probably have to own and drive as a data leader, avoiding the temptation to use complicated technical concepts and language. And this is to make probably the most profound point about below the waterline value, which is that if AI becomes a pervasive way of solving problems and generating value across your organization, that is, if it becomes fully democratized, you will actually change the way everyone works. Imagine if anybody could access any data from any silo, find an innovation in the course of their daily work, as I was just discussing, and then share that as a reusable building block with anyone else, including senior management. This would radically improve coordination of activities across your organization and do away with dozens and dozens of committees, forums, and steering groups of potentially disengaged stakeholders who don't really want to be there but feel that they must. Again, you can do a case study here, try to estimate how much time different kinds of people spend on meetings like that, and then ask them what additional value they would create if you could give them back a day a week. So we've seen some of our customers do that. It's definitely possible. And that's, transformative value if you're able to give dozens or hundreds or thousands of people back a day a week. You don't have to explain what they're going to do with that day a week. That's part of their imagination, and that's how you bring them into the story. But the point is, you are giving them a capability that will make them possible. And that, again, elevates that discussion out of what use cases have you built for me recently. So those were some ideas on quantifying under the waterline value to build a business case that will get you all the way to the top of the mountain. But what about the danger zone in between? So that's after that really energizing success of those initial high value use cases, but before you reach those lofty goals. As I mentioned before, building value stories here is really tricky because it's all about mitigating risk, which, let's face it, is not a naturally energizing subject for most people. And furthermore, the economic problem is that investment in resilience doesn't pay off in the same way as a massive use case that you delivered as a crowning achievement. Investing in resilience just prepares you for shocks and challenges that you actually hope won't happen. So our overall recommendation here is to reframe resilience away from being an expensive add-on that slows things down and takes more time and all those negative connotations. You need to reframe it to something positive. And here's how. So the first under the waterline value to focus on here is resilience to technology change. Whether you're migrating data from an on-premise warehouse to Snowflake or changing public clouds, you must assume from the outset that the ground underneath you will shift constantly. Ideally, it won't happen over the course of those initial use cases, right? But that kind of lets you off the hook easy. You get your time to value there. And ideally, no one changes the ground under your feet during that initial period. But we all know that something will change soon about the technical landscape in your business. And the risk and the cost here is in tying your AI initiative too closely to any single way of doing things in any single part of your stack. But of course, that is not a very attractive message for your stakeholders, for the investors in your AI initiative. Instead, you want to use the same problem, but reframe it and build up the value of agility in the face of this change. So instead say, what if by building resilience, you freed the hands of others to make the infrastructure choices that will achieve their objectives while everything you've done keeps running? So there's two streams of value here that you can estimate. The cost saved by you avoiding costly rebuilds, right? So if you have to rebuild the same business logic in different technology, it's going to take you between 50 and 100% of the time that it took to do it the first time, right? So you can estimate that yourself. And then there's another benefit, which is if you are not stopping them seeking their technology change, you're removing a barrier to them and increasing their agility. So there's two positive value stories you can get out of building resilience to this kind of risk. Of course, it's not only technological change you need to be prepared for in advance, it's business change as well. We sometimes hear about AI initiatives where the technical people talk to the business in some workshops, then went into a black box for months and months to build something. And the problem is the longer you stay locked away from the business feedback, good or bad, the more the potential you have to run off the road, right? That's why here I've put headlights on the car. That's the change you need to make. Problem is the longer you wait to re-engage, the higher the psychological cost of admitting you may have taken the wrong road in the first place. Again, this problem, this risk, this negative feeling can be reframed to something positive by focusing on how deep involvement by the business, preferably hands-on, in any AI projects will actually increase the relevance of those projects, increase their impact, much more than it will slow things down. So to quantify this, we recommend that one of your initial use cases not be purely technical in nature, but actually involve a diverse set of stakeholders so that even in that first initial race to initial value, you actually prove to the business the value of this kind of collaboration. And the last one here may not be something you naturally include in a business case, but it's increasingly on organizations' agenda. It's something that people are worried about. Basically, the more you use AI, the more you are delegating decisions to these models that you've built. And sometimes they go wrong, like any technology. But when they do, the headlines can look terrible for those who let this happen. And those events are low in probability, but they're very high in bottom line impact. If you get fined, or if your name is dragged through the press along with some really unflattering clip art of killer robots or algorithms gone mad. And of course, these issues are unlikely to emerge in those initial use cases, which are going to be time boxed, right? But you need to build a story early on about what it will take to be responsible when you build AI from the very beginning, because doing things carefully and deliberately will actually slow you down a bit. But the positive payoff is that putting in place the relevant practices up front will make you more agile in the long run, because you and your team will feel safer innovating if you know that you've got some guardrails established around what you build and how it goes out into the world. Okay, I'll briefly return here to our iceberg, just to leave you with some take-home messages. So remember, we talked about the need to find the value below the waterline, right? And I hope you realize from what I've said, the value of building that broader business case that actually goes beyond your initial use cases. I'm not saying those are unimportant, you need them to get started, but they're really just proof points for something bigger that you want to achieve, right? Which relies on surfacing this below the waterline value. And those lofty goals, that bigger thing you want to achieve, can still be quantified, even if it looks nebulous sometimes. But you have to go beyond use case and project-centric thinking, because use cases are not actually the point of that stream of value. To understand this under the waterline value, you've got to get into the weeds of how your whole business works to find that transformative impact and understand how a different way of doing things will create benefits for lots and lots of people. And third, to avoid being shouted out of the room for raising the risks of AI and the need for resilience after you've already started your initial use cases, raise it early by reframing risk mitigation as superpowers that actually increase your agility, increase your ability to deliver and change use cases and attack relevant problems in the organization. Again, these costs can be quantified from prior experiences and even during initial use cases. Finally, if you're interested in more on this topic, we published this white paper last year, laying out some of these ideas in greater detail, and we'll be publishing more this year. And as I said at the start, I'm really keen to hear from you directly, so please get in touch, because I can't be with you today to answer questions after the presentation. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the rest of the day.